Right, well, let's move on to our next discussion. It's been a year since the Government of National Unity was formed after historic elections which marked an end to one-party governance nationally. Well, tonight we look back at the achievements and failures of GNU, especially when it comes to service delivery. This is after Build One South Africa scored the governing coalition 4 out of 10, or 40%, citing the high unemployment rate as one of its biggest failures. Action SA has given the GNU an F symbol when it comes to improving basic services. But what matters most, of course, is the data. And for that, we are joined by Statistician-General, Mr. Risenga Maluleke, joining us for more on what the numbers actually say. Statistician-General, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We certainly can have political parties coming out and speaking of what they view the performance of GNU really to look like. But you really need to look at the data coming out of Stats SA to be able to give a proper scorecard. And I thought, let's bring you in and get some of that data. I do want to start with unemployment and perhaps talk to us about why that is such an important measure, if you will, such an important measure of whether or not an administration is actually working. Perhaps that's a good place for us to start before we go into the data, the importance of looking specifically at opportunities created for South Africans.
Well, let me greet you and greet the viewers at home and start off by saying that the job of Stats SA is not to measure policy or to measure performance in a short space of time, but it does give indicators of what is happening, and whether policy is performing or something, it's a remit of other people. Having said so, let us look at issues, one, like universal enrollment in schools. And I'm pulling at different sources of data, one from our census, two from what we call our general household survey. So what we are seeing is that the number of people with no schooling is declining in South Africa. And when you talk about people who are finishing some primary and completed primary, it's declining. But as that happens, the number of people who are finishing matric has increased sharply from about 16% way back in 2002 to about 37% as of now. So we can see more people are getting education. However, the throughput to institutions of higher learning is still struggling. We started at about 6% way back at 2002, and we are now sitting at about 12%. So it's not about looking at the GNU, it's about looking at the story that the data is saying from at the beginning or around the beginning of our democracy. That is on the side of education. But when you look at electricity, for example, in terms of connectivity and infrastructure, we started at about 65%. We are now sitting at about 88% in terms of connectivity to electricity, with almost every municipality in the country having gone above 80%. However, there's one municipality in KwaZulu-Natal, eMadlangeni. That's the only municipality that is sitting at 72%. And we are talking about connectivity. I'm not talking about disruptions of load shedding and load reduction. Then let's come to look at water. At the Eastern Seaboard, that is your KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape, have the highest, the 10 poorest municipalities are found in these two provinces. And that's when you look at the multidimensional measure of poverty. And they are the ones that have struggled the most with water connections. But between census 1996 all the way to 2011, we saw an increase in the connectivity of water, and water as a main source at household level, whether it's within the house or within the yard. Now, but between 2011 and 2022, we have seen provinces like Limpopo starting to decline in terms of connectivity to water. And when you compare the Eastern Cape and Limpopo, both of them started below average. The Eastern Cape was sitting at about 33%. The Eastern Cape has now surpassed the national average according to our data, but Limpopo still hasn't surpassed the national average in terms of water connectivity. Disruptions are still a...
Yeah, if I can just interrupt you, apologies, Statistician General, but I'm looking for, as you talk about 2022 declining in water access, declining in Limpopo. Do we have the latest as to what they look like in 2024, 2025? With that data?
Yes, that's what our general household survey is saying, that we are seeing a decline, a continued decline of water connectivity in Limpopo, or access to clean water per se. And having said so, the disruptions are universal across the country. People have taps in their yards, people have taps in their houses, but for those who have experienced disruptions of 2 days in a month or about more than 15 days a year, we are sitting at about 32% nationally. So you can see in some provinces, water is going down, but disruptions are actually universal across the whole country, 32%.
Yeah. I mean, that's important numbers that we've looked at, and that, of course, speaks to basic services. I do want to go back to the issue of jobs, and I obviously am doing the comparison of GNU and pre-GNU, which you've said is really not what Stats SA is looking at. You're going to look at the data and not look at policy and what politicians certainly are doing. But this data important, and I'm going to go through some of the numbers, and you can tell me what they're telling us, short term, perhaps even long term, for instance. So let's look at 2025's quarter one. Expanded definition of unemployment was at 43.1%. That's at the beginning of this year. Last year, that number was at 50, it was at 62.4%. Perhaps you can assist me with that. Or 59, no, apologies, 59.7%. No, I think I'm wrong, sorry, 41.9%. No. Yeah, so you've seen a decline in the past year in the number of expanded definition of unemployment, that being a green shoot for the past year, and certainly this administration. So 43.1% in 2025, 41.9% in 2024.
Well, employment numbers are very sensitive to changes that may occur internally in the country and externally. But it is not enough to compare, say, the last quarter of 2024 to the first quarter of 2025. Why it is not enough is because if you look at the first quarter of 2025, we will have seen that both the narrow definition of unemployment, which we are tracking at the National Development Plan, has increased. It jumped by 1 percentage point from 31.9% to 32.9%. The expanded definition as well has moved from about 41% to 43.1%.
Right, yes.
And before I come to that, there was a lot of noise in about a week to 10 days now, that Stats SA doesn't count people in the informal sector. Let me put it categorically clear that we do count people in the informal sector, whether they are taxi drivers, whether they are people who are selling at street corners, in trains, or there are people who are selling fed cooks, or they are selling on the pub and meat on the roadside. We do count them, and they account to 3.3 million of our population, our working age, which then accounts to 19.5%. Now, having said so, let us come to the point that you are raising. According to the ILO definition, is that a person is working if they work for a minimum of an hour a week, and that is a minimum of 4 hours a month. As long as when they are working, they get paid for that work. It's not like they are being paid in kind, whether it's a bag of tomatoes or potatoes. Now, the first quarter has one peculiar issue. It's because you have new entrants into the labor market. You have people who have entered the labor market from universities who are now looking for employment. And those who have finished matric and other institutions of higher learning, be it a 1 year or a 6-month certificate they were doing. So they enter in large numbers. That is why we have seen every now and then the first quarter does increase the numbers. However, there is a point that we must look back at. In the National Development Plan, we had said by the year 2020, we want our unemployment to be sitting at 14%. By then, it was sitting at 28, 29%. It was almost double what we aspired to have. By the year 2030, as if the year 2030 would never arrive, we have said in our National Development Plan, we want unemployment to be sitting at 6%. It's now sitting at 32.9%, almost 33%. And we are just 5 years ago away from going to 2030. So if you ask me, there are those who are saying we do not have an unemployment challenge in South Africa. I'm saying the numbers that we are collecting at Stats, and they have a lot of methodological rigor, which we make available on the web when we release numbers, are showing that we have an unemployment challenge in South Africa.
Right. Yeah. Let me do this because I do need to let you go. And I'm sure you can tell from the previous question that I certainly am no statistician, and those numbers throwing me for a bit of a loop. But you talk about comparing quarter 4 to quarter 1. What I want to do is look at quarter 1, 2025 to quarter 1, 2024. And I'll give you one last one, and perhaps you can even give us your closing thoughts with that one. But when we talk about unemployment and access to opportunity and, you know, how we measure whether or not an administration is working, a lot of the time we'll focus on youth. So I'm going to take this slowly because, like I said, not a statistician. 15 to 24-year-olds, unemployment rate in 2024, quarter 1. So in the first 3 months of last year, that number was sitting at 59.7%. It's gone up in the past year. So at the beginning of this year, the first quarter of this year, GNU administration, that same age group, 15 to 24, that unemployment number sitting at 62.4%. So the point I'm making is in the past year, even with the switchover of administrations, youth unemployment has in fact increased. So even as you offer the data, I mean, is there a sense that the recommendations that are put forward by Stats SA on how to change those numbers are being heard?
We don't put recommendations. One is Stats SA doesn't put recommendations to government on what to do. It's not our responsibility, or let me say it's not our remit to do so. Because the moment we start putting recommendations, and when we later go to measure, our recommendations don't match what we have advised government to do, we will shy away from making the numbers available. And once we do that, we'll have lost our independence. And losing independence of scientific rigor is something we protect like a hawk protecting its eggs. Having said so, we're talking about 59% and an increase in the first quarter of this year by about 3.1 percentage points. I want us to go a little bit backwards. Young people have been vulnerable to labor markets, particularly those aged 15 to 24 years. It's not now. Obviously, the percentage keeps on increasing or going backwards, but they have been vulnerable to labor markets. And we should not look at it that way alone. We should also go to the space where we have about 10.3 million young people aged 15 to 24 years. Of those, 3.8 million are not in employment, education, or training. They wake up and roam the streets. And having said so, it is the first time in my 8 years tenure as Statistician-General to see the number rising to 3.8 million of those not in employment, education, or training. They have started at about 3.2, 3.3 million. But as the population increases, we see a lot more young people being vulnerable. It's not only them, even Black African women particularly.
Okay.
So when you are young and you are Black African, you are much more vulnerable to labor markets than any other population group. And let me just take you through a little bit of numbers. The unemployment rate for the white population group in the first quarter is sitting at about 7.8%. Whites had never experienced high unemployment in South Africa. At some stage, they were 5% or less more than a decade ago, so they were not considered as unemployed. The colored population group has been, the Indian population group was sitting at about 13.3%. The colored population group at about, it hovers between 22 and 24%. The Black Africans in general are always above the national average, with the national average sitting at 32.9%. The Black Africans are sitting at 37%. When you disaggregate to women, it goes higher to about 39%. And I'm not talking about expanded, I'm talking about the narrow definition.
Right.
When you take the expanded, Black African women go as far as about closer to 50%. When they are young and 15 to 24 years, it's even much more was the challenging for them.
Yeah. As Statistician-General, we could talk for a very long time because there is so much data to look at as we assess our performance. And of course, some of the comparisons going back further than just a year, but important for us to start to analyze just if any progress was made in the past 12 months as we look at a year of the Government of National Unity. We'll keep assessing it though. Thank you so much to Risenga Maluleke, who is Statistician-General.